This show is part of the Proclaim Podcast Network, thoughtfully crafted, faithfully told stories that proclaim His name. More at proclaim.fm.
My first question is, so Sister Tong, tell me about the prison. So my translator translates the question. Sister Tong gets this amazing smile on her face. She says something in Chinese, and the translator says, "Oh, yes, that was a wonderful time." And my first thought was, there's no way he translated the question right.
I'm Paul Hastings, and you're listening to Compelled, where we use gripping, immersive storytelling to bring to life Christian testimonies from the kingdom of God, told by the people compelled to live for Him. In a recent episode, we heard from John Erickson, the author of the popular children's book series, Hank the Cowdog. We learned how John used his Christian worldview to shape much of his Hank the Cowdog series, and also how he came to understand that God's plan for him as a children's author was very different than his own. You can hear that story by tuning into episode number 24 with John Erickson. Today's guest is Todd Nettleton from Voice of the Martyrs. Todd finds and tells stories of modern-day Christians who are being persecuted and martyred throughout the world for their Christian faith. And while that may sound like an emotionally taxing job, and it is, Todd is adamant that there are few greater honors than co-laboring with these saints and telling their stories of God's faithfulness. So gather round, lean in, and join us for another compelling story from the kingdom of God. I met with Todd Nettleton at the Voice of the Martyrs headquarters in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, right as a storm was pulling in, so you'll occasionally hear some rolls of thunder in the background. Todd plays a key role at Voice of the Martyrs, which is documenting the martyrdom and persecution of Christians around the world today. He has a powerful desire to share the stories of our brothers and sisters who are persecuted for their faith in Jesus. But of course, I wanted to know how God led Todd into this field today. So Todd began telling me about a missionary he read about in a book as a 10-year-old boy whose testimony made a lifelong impression on him.
Stanley Dale went to New Guinea. He's got really an amazing story. He was a stubborn, bullheaded man, but he loved the Lord and he wanted to share the gospel. And his first mission board fired him.
Oh, wow.
His second mission board also fired him. And he wanted to go where no one else was going. And he finally went to this tribe called the Yali, shared the gospel. Some of them got saved, but they killed him. He was martyred, shot with bow and arrows. And as each arrow hit him, he would pull it out, break it in half, and drop it on the ground. And as a 10-year-old boy, I was so captivated by that image of, this guy who is so courageous and so bold and such a hero. Then, 2 years later, our family moves to the island of New Guinea, the very island where he had served. And in this book, it talks about what makes us do something, go to a place where they don't want us, put our life on the line. Stanley Dale was inspired by the story of William Tyndale. He actually preached a sermon where he talked about William Tyndale, and Tyndale translated the Bible into English, for which he was killed. So he inspires Stanley Dale. Stanley Dale goes to New Guinea, gives his life, is martyred for the faith. His story is written down by Don Richardson. My dad reads it to my brother and I'm inspired by his story. Who knows who's going to be inspired by Extreme Devotion or by the work that I do now at Voice of the Martyrs Radio? And what story are they going to write that my grandkids and my great-grandkids are going to read about someday? That's how inspiration works. But in order for that to happen, we have to tell the stories. We have to pass on whether it's, reading to our kids or listening to a podcast or encouraging somebody else to listen to a podcast. What are we doing? And I really, as I've thought about it in the last couple of weeks, I don't think it's an accident that my dad read the story of a Christian martyr to me when I was 10 years old, and I work at Voice of the Martyrs for the last 21 years. I think that's all part of God sort of preparing the way and drawing us along the path that he has for us.
Tell me about Papua New Guinea just briefly. Like, what was that like as a 12-year-old kid?
Papua New Guinea is a pretty amazing place. The island of New Guinea, on the island, there are more than 1,000 languages spoken. And so you'll have little tribes of people where it's, a few thousand people that speak the language. We were located in a city where, this sounds terrible, but my parents were called hostile parents, but it's Hostel.
Yeah.
And we lived in the city and had anywhere from 9 to 12 missionary kids that would come if their parents were out in the bush where there weren't any schools. They would come and live with us during the school year. And so I picked up, 9 to 12 brothers and sisters every semester. And we would all sit around the table for dinner. It was quite an adventure. Looking back on it now, I can't, as a parent now, I just can't imagine doing that.
Yeah.
But that was part of their ministry. And then my dad was the pastor of an English-speaking congregation there. And so we served for 4 years. If you look at some of the things that I do now and some of the skills that I have, some of them go back to the 4 years in Papua New Guinea because we didn't have a television.
Yeah.
So I learned to read. I knew how to read, obviously, but I learned to read for pleasure. And I learned to read and really value storytelling and value words.
Yeah.
And what do I do now? I use words to tell stories about persecuted Christians. So I really trace the work that I do now to that move in 1982 to Papua New Guinea because it really did alter the course of my life.
Wow.
In really dramatic ways.
Todd eventually returned to the United States when he was 16 years old and went on to study journalism and communication in the middle of Oklahoma. He eventually worked a handful of jobs, including for a small newspaper at the college he had attended. But he still sensed that God was calling him elsewhere.
I was feeling like I wanted to do something different, but I wasn't 100% sure what it was. And my wife and I talked about it. I sent a bunch of resumes. I actually sent a bunch of resumes back to California. Hey, maybe this is the time we'll move back to California. There's never ice storms there. It's wonderful. We should go there. And I never got even a sniff or a phone call. Nothing. It was like a brick wall.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget it because we were in a Bible study with some other young couples that met on Wednesday nights. And I just shared 1 week in the Bible study. I said, I don't know what's going on. I feel like there's something different for me to be doing. But I've sent resumes. I've never gotten any callbacks. Nobody cares. So just, ask the group to pray, that the Lord will open the right door at the right time. And within 24 hours, actually, I had 2 job offers.
Wow.
I was like, wow, okay, we should have asked the group to pray sooner.
Yeah.
So one of those was here at the Voice of the Martyrs, and the lady that hired me, who actually her office is right through that wall there.
Okay.
But she is married to my college roommate, and she was tasked, VOM was quite a bit smaller then than it is now. She was tasked with building a communications department. They did not have a communications department. And so she was looking for somebody with a journalism background to tell stories of persecuted Christians. And I love telling stories, and I do have a journalism background. And so about 3 months later, I started my first day at VOM. And that was 21 years ago, and I'm still here.
Wow. Wow.
So
for those that are listening, can you describe what is Voice of the Martyrs? What does it do? I mean, there's a lot of people that have heard of it, but I know that there's many more have. What is Voice of the Martyrs? Sounds depressing.
Well, it is not depressing. Voice of the Martyrs is a ministry to persecuted Christians. And so we serve in 70 plus countries where Christians face some kind of persecution or hardship for following Christ. And we do that through kind of 3 main areas in our overseas work. One is persecution response, which is basically helping those who've been persecuted. If you're injured in persecution, we'll help get medical care. If the pastor dad gets thrown in prison, we'll help pay the rent for mom and the kids or pay the school fees for the kids so they don't have to drop out of school. So that's persecution response. The second area is Bibles. Every year we distribute north of 1 million Bibles into hostile and restricted nations. And then the third area is what we call frontline workers. And I sort of half-kiddingly call them pre-persecuted Christians because they are doing gospel work in a place where Christians are persecuted. They likely will be persecuted at some point. And we've actually had some of our frontline workers have been martyred because of their faith. So persecution response, Bibles, frontline workers. And then here in the U.S., we tell the stories of persecuted Christians to invite American Christians into fellowship, well, what Paul calls the fellowship of Christ's suffering. The Bible says when one part of the body suffers, we're all supposed to feel that pain. We can't do that if there's no connection. If we don't know that there's suffering going on, we can't feel the pain. So Voice of the Martyrs is a connection point, connecting the church in hostile and restricted nations with the church in the U.S. And that's really my part of the ministry in writing stories, writing for the newsletter occasionally, but then mostly in producing Voice of the Martyrs Radio, which is our radio show and podcast, heard on a little over 1,000 radio stations, as well as the podcast. And that's a great opportunity because you get to hear directly from the persecuted Christian. It's not me telling their story, it's them telling their story.
Yeah.
I'm just asking questions and kind of trying to tee it up for them. So we have on the radio program, we have Christians who have faced persecution. We have frontline workers who are working in one of those restricted nations, but maybe haven't been persecuted yet. And then we have some of our own VOM staff who are in and out of those countries. When they come back from a trip, I'll drag them in the studio and say, hey, tell me about the people you met on your trip.
Yeah.
So hopefully it is a window into our brothers and sisters who are suffering. And like I say, that creates a connection point where when they suffer, we suffer with them and we can pray for them and we can stand with them.
As Todd has worked closely with those who've experienced persecution firsthand, a couple of key verses from the Bible have stood out to him.
Hebrews 13:3 is remember those in prison as if you were in prison with them. That's kind of the foundational verse for VOM. But then even in the Beatitudes, Jesus says, blessed are you when people persecute you, which is such a foreign concept for us as American Christians. Almost none of us would be persecuted and think, boy, what a blessing, I get to be persecuted.
Yeah.
We would say, hey, I'm calling my lawyer, I'm calling the cops, I'm calling somebody. Jesus said, blessed are you when you're persecuted.
Yeah. Tell us about a few of the stories that you've personally encountered.
When you say persecuted Christian, the first story that I think of, and the first person, and I can absolutely picture her in my mind, is a lady that we met in China named Sister Tong. And my wife was with me on the trip, which was an added blessing. So she got to meet Sister Tong as well. But Sister Tong had just been released after serving 6 months in prison. And the reason she was thrown in prison is because she had what they would call an unregistered religious gathering at her home. So she was the host of a house church.
Yeah.
So they raided the church. They threw her in prison for 6 months, and she had just gotten out right before we went and saw her. And so this was 20 years ago now. It was very early in my time at VOM.
Todd fully expected that Sister Tong would be downtrodden and hopeless after a year in prison under the worst conditions. But the story that Sister Tong told would change Todd's life forever. Coming up after the break. Welcome back to Compelled. Todd Nettleton is the host of Voice of the Martyrs Radio. In one of the first interviews with a persecuted Christian, he asked Sister Tong, a member of an underground church, about her experiences spending 9 months in prison.
My first question is, so Sister Tong, tell me about the prison. And what I'm picturing in my American journalistic mind is, tell me how miserable it was. Tell me how hard the bed was. Tell me how cold it was. Tell me how the rain leaked in when it rained. So my translator translates the question. Sister Tong gets this amazing smile on her face. She says something in Chinese, and the translator says, oh, yes, that was a wonderful time. And my first thought was, there's no way he translated the question right. We seriously have a translation issue here because there is no way he asked about prison. And then she said, wonderful time. That didn't compute with me at all. But she went on to say then, Jesus was so close to me in that prison cell. He was right there with me every single day. It was an amazing time with God. And she said, there were some other ladies in my cell and they didn't know Christ. And so I got to be the one who shared Christ with them. And some of them are now walking with Christ.
Yeah.
So those 6 months was an amazing time because God was with me and he gave me a ministry to do there.
Yeah.
That absolutely exploded my mind.
Yeah.
I mean, just to think that someone could think of prison as a wonderful time was earth-shattering to me. And so I will always think of that. And I picture her smile because and you mentioned it, Voice of the Martyrs, that's probably depressing. We have this picture of, these persecuted Christians are probably horribly depressed and just wondering if God is still on the throne. And boy, we probably need to go and encourage them and let them know that things are going to be all right. But when you go and sit down with them, they are not depressed. They are not discouraged. They are excited about what God is doing. They're excited about how the church is growing in their country. They're excited that they have an opportunity and a ministry to help with that growth. They are the farthest thing from depressed. And I frankly often come home and think, why aren't more people at my church, including me, like them, having that sense of joy, having that sense of excitement? Wow, we get to serve the Lord today. Can you believe this? This is amazing. Instead of, it's a rough week and this went wrong and that went wrong and my neighbors don't like me and it's like, wait a minute, we get to work with the King of Kings. What's not exciting about that? What's not to love?
Yeah.
So Sister Tong immediately comes to mind just because of the impact she had on me, just as a young, sort of new to VOM reporter, hearing that, wait a minute, prison can be a wonderful time if God is the one who sends you there and allows you to have a ministry there.
Yeah, that truly sounds like a providential interview that God had orchestrated for that formational point in your VOM career that you had.
Absolutely, it was.
As I listened to Todd's story about how Sister Tong embraced the persecution she had endured, I was struck by her submission to God's plan in her life. But then I asked Todd, of all the people he's met and the stories he's heard, what was one of the most convicting testimonies that he's ever encountered?
I get lots of conviction when I talk to persecuted Christians. I think of how they treat their Bibles, how they value the Bible. I've found that very convicting. But I think probably the most convicting is I met a man in Laos. The name that I've used for him is Brother Fan. And he had this amazing story. He lived in a village off in the sticks in Laos. He decided, this village life is not for me. I'm going to go to the big city. I've heard, there's lots of opportunity there and I'll make lots of money and it'll be grand. And he went to Vientiane, which is the capital city of Laos. And they weren't very warm and welcoming, and he didn't immediately find a job and things were pretty rough. And he remembered that he had heard that, if you find a building with a cross on top, sometimes they have free rice, and he was hungry. And so he was like, I'm going to try that. And he found a church. He went inside. He heard the gospel. He got saved and immediately got on the bus, went back into the sticks to his village and led over 100 people to Christ.
Wow.
With one sermon.
Wow.
He had heard one sermon.
Wow.
So he just went back and repeated what he had been told.
Oh, praise God.
And led 100 people to Christ. That story convicted me incredibly because as a pastor's kid, as a missionary kid, I've heard thousands of sermons. Thousands. But how often do I hear that sermon and immediately put it into practice or immediately go to someone and say, hey, my pastor shared this story today. I just got to tell you this. Almost never.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is not my typical sermon response.
Yeah.
So I found Brother Fan's story just incredibly convicting that, if God could use one sermon in his life to lead 100 people to Christ, what if we give God the 3 sermons that we hear every week, or the thousands of sermons that we've heard over our lifetime. What could God do if we were willing to be an instrument of that? What could he do with that? Well, who knows? I mean, he could change the world.
Yeah.
But we have to be willing, and we have to understand that we're not just going to church to get a sermon to sort of to feel good or to check it off our list for the week or to just grow ourselves in a vacuum. The whole point is we're being equipped to reach out. We're being fueled to spread that around. And Brother Fan was a great reminder of that for me.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm just like, whoa, I'm convicted just hearing that. Because I think
you've heard more than one sermon also.
Yeah. Oh yeah. For sure.
Let me share one more story.
Yeah, please.
That really was a God thing. And I may cry while I tell this story. In 2007, there were 3 men that were killed in the offices of a Christian publishing house in Turkey. 2 of them were Turkish, 1 was German. It was the first Turkish martyrs since the Turkish Revolution. So basically in 100 years, the first time Turkish Christians had laid down their lives for Christ.
Yeah.
And that happened, I believe, on a Wednesday. On Friday afternoon, I was at my desk. We were not in this building. We were at the old building. And a phone call comes through from a guy in Turkey. I have no idea why he called VOM. I have no idea why the call got routed to me. But he was calling because one of the Turkish Christians was going to have his funeral the next day. And he was just asking us to pray because this man's family was still Muslims. And there was the potential for some real problems at that funeral. And he just said, hey, we're here. I don't know what you can do about it. I sent an email around to the staff before I left for the weekend. But somehow that story just kind of grabbed me, in a God way. I don't have an explanation for it, but it just kind of lodged in my mind.
Yeah.
The next week, we're sitting around our table at home. We're reading our devotional about Elisha. And somehow I just began to weep at the table. And I think my family thought, Dad is finally cracking up. And I think from the Lord, I really began to pray because those 3 men, 2 of them were married and had 5 kids. The 3rd man was engaged, but not married yet. But I began to pray for those kids that God would give them, as he did in the case of Elisha, a double portion of their father's spirit.
Yeah.
And so that was my prayer, and I didn't think much about it. We didn't have any more contact from Turkey. I didn't know, much. I knew the funeral had gone off without a problem, so that was good. But 7 weeks later, I was in Turkey, and VOM had sent me to try to do some interviews, and we're going to do some writing about this story. So go and interview. And amazing God thing. It's a long story. We'd have to take like 4 podcasts to tell it. But the first widow that I went to talk to at first didn't want to talk to me. And then she said, okay, go ahead and come. And we had an amazing visit, just a really great visit. Then we went and met the fiance of the 3rd man, and she was devastated.
Yeah.
One of the things in her story that is really sad is a lot of people in her community and even some in her own family didn't know that she was a Christian before this. And so she went from not being identified as a Christian to suddenly having her name and her home address published in the local paper as, hey, this is a Christian. The other part, this was explained to me by some of our Turkish coworkers that were along with me, was if she had shown the full extent of her grief, in the Turkish culture, it would have said that her and her fiance were sleeping together. Because, how could you be that sad if you weren't sleeping together? And so she couldn't really show how heartbroken she was. She had to kind of keep a stiff upper lip and just be like, yeah, it's sad, but, which when we met with her, she was devastated. She was just absolutely devastated. And as a young single Christian in a culture where there aren't hardly any Christians, she also was devastated by the thought that I may never get married now because, my chances of finding a Christian husband in this culture are minimal. I found one. What's the chances that I'll ever find another one?
Yeah.
And so her heartbreak was just so palpable. So I met with them, and then I flew to another part of Turkey where I was going to try to meet with the third widow. And I had a pastor that picked me up, and he was going to take me. And we got in the car, we start driving, and his phone rings. And I could just see on his face that it wasn't good news. And he hung up the phone. He didn't speak a lot of English, but he said, she's tired. She said, don't come today. And I'm like, I'm flying home tomorrow. So this is my only day. But I also thought, I've got to meet this first widow. I had an amazing interview with her. I got to meet the fiance. And I was like, Lord, this has already been an amazing trip. If this third woman can't see me, this has already been amazing. You've blessed me amazingly to let me come and do this. And so the pastor and I went to breakfast, and he was just going to take me to my hotel. I figured I'd have an extra day of just kind of bumming around in Istanbul, which I love Istanbul, so that was no problem. So we're eating breakfast, and his phone rings again. And he looks at me after he hangs up and says, she said, go ahead and come. We can come for an hour. And I'm like, okay, that's great. So we drove, and it was like an hour drive to get there. And we met another guy who was I found out later, was kind of screening us to make sure, is this okay? Should we really do this?
Yeah.
And then we went and met with this lady. Her name is Shamsa. And I walked in the door, and she introduced me to her daughter, whose name is Esther. And she introduced me to her son, and she said, this is Elisha. And I was just like, I've been praying for a double portion of God's Spirit to fall on these children. And I've come half a world away, and his name is Elisha. It literally took my breath away. I was like, I can't believe this. And so I had to tell him the story. I'm like, we were reading devotions at our table. I started crying. I've been praying for your kids to have a double portion. I can't believe your son's name is Elisha. And that sort of just broke all the ice. And we ended up, like I said, we spent about 8 hours together, and she shared her story. They had an amazing, amazing story because early on in their married life, her husband, she had actually helped lead him to Christ. And then they got married. They were in ministry together, and he got arrested and spent about a month in prison. And she said after he was released from prison, they sat down and they talked about, okay, we could be Christians and go to church on Sunday and even do some ministry stuff, but kind of low-key it, and we probably won't have any more trouble. We probably won't have any more persecution. You don't have to go to jail again. Or we can do everything that God calls us to do and go 100 miles an hour, but if we do that, there will be persecution.
Yeah.
And they sat down and decided together, no, we're going to go 100 miles an hour. We're going to do everything God asks us to do. And if there's persecution, so be it. God is faithful.
Yeah.
So they made that decision. A few years later, her husband is martyred. But it wasn't a surprise to them. It was a decision they had already made. They had already counted the cost. We spent just an amazing day hearing her story and recording it and talking to her and praying together and eating together and drinking tea together and all those wonderful Central Asian fellowship rituals. And so I came home to America. I got to write a feature for our newsletter here at Voice of the Martyrs. I got to do a lot of radio interviews talking about Turkey, talking about these amazing ladies and their story. And a few years later, Shamsa actually left Turkey and moved to America and settled in Denver, Colorado.
Wow.
And my wife is from Colorado Springs. So one summer we were up at her folks' house, and we were going to be in Denver that day. And I just sent an email to Shamsa and said, could we take you out to lunch while we're there? She said, yes, that's fine. But my in-laws went with us. And at the end of the lunch, they, exchanged phone numbers and said, hey, we just live down in Colorado Springs. If you ever need any help, we could, we're happy to help. We're not that far away. And since that time, they have kind of become adopted grandparents to Shamsa's kids. And so I've come to see very clearly that it was totally God's plan that I get that phone call on a Friday afternoon that just came through the switchboard, and that I go to Turkey and meet these families because God wanted to connect Shamsa with my in-laws. And that wouldn't have happened if it had been someone else that went over there and saw them. And so that has been a very pivotal sort of turning point for me too. And just seeing God doesn't just ordain, hey, here's a job for you. Like he ordains specific tasks and specific contacts and specific relationships that he wants to use to shape you and to shape the other person. Since that time, I think I do a better job of not taking for granted every interaction, every conversation, every meeting, every place that I get to go, the person who sits beside me on a plane. It's not an accident that that person's sitting there. God knew from the creation of the world that we were going to be sitting there together. And so just having my eyes a little more open to see God's hand at work in my life and in the lives of people around me, I think was a result of that trip to Turkey.
You may have noticed a pattern. No matter where Todd has traveled or where his stories have originated from, they're always pointing back to God's master plan of proclaiming the kingdom of heaven to the nations, even in the face of suffering. But what I wanted to know is, how can we in the West take part in that plan? How can we help our persecuted brothers and sisters overseas? And Todd's answer was eye-opening, which you'll hear right after the break. Welcome back to Compelled. Todd Nettleton has shared about his decades of experiences with Voice of the Martyrs, discovering and relaying stories of Christian persecution. And he refers to believers overseas as brothers and sisters. So I asked him, why should that matter to us here in the Western world?
You use the term brother and sister to describe these martyrs. Can you go into detail on that?
I think that's one of the key things for American Christians to understand. These are our brothers and sisters. These are parts of our spiritual family. And I have two earthly brothers, and if one of them was in jail getting beaten on every day, I would be beside myself. I would be calling my congressman. I would be calling the police warden. I'd be calling the press. I'd be calling everybody who would listen to say, listen, they're beating on my brother. You got to do something about this.
Yeah.
They are beating on our brothers. They are beating on our sisters. We need to have that sense of urgency that comes out of understanding that family relationship, that, no, it's not just a guy in China. It's my brother in China. And so that's why I emphasize that, because it is that family relationship and it gives us that sense of urgency.
Yeah. What would you say along those same lines? What would you say for those that are listening? Like, how can someone get involved? Like, here we are in cozy America or Canada or wherever our listeners are. What can we literally do?
I always encourage people to go through a 3-step process. And the first step is pray. And that's the first thing that persecuted Christians ask us to do. And they, interestingly, because this is different, I think, from most of how most of us would be, it's not a prayer that persecution will stop or that they won't suffer anymore. It's a prayer that they will be faithful to Christ in spite of the hardship, in spite of the suffering.
Wow.
So number 1, pray. And again, that's their request, not mine. Number 2 is educate yourself so that you can pray more effectively. Because it's easy to say, God bless the persecuted church, but it's also easy to forget to say, God bless the persecuted church. But when it's a specific pastor in a specific prison, then it's more personal and it's more direct. God bless this pastor, or a specific country, a specific people group. Pray, educate yourself so that you can pray more effectively. And then step 3 is, as you're praying and as you're learning more, God's going to open some doors in front of you, or he's going to lay some things on your heart and say, hey, this is what I want you to do. And then you just have to obey. And Voice of the Martyrs has lots of ways to help connect you. One of the ways is prisoneralert.com. We have a website where you can write letters to Christians in prison. The website actually translates it into the language of the prisoner. So when you print it out, it's in their language. They can read it. The guards can read it when it gets to the prison. So maybe when you're praying and learning more, God's going to say, hey, I want you to write letters to prisoners. Okay, do that. Maybe he's going to say, I want you to send Bibles. Do that. Maybe he's going to say, get on a plane and go to China, go to Afghanistan. Do that. But I think it starts as we pray and as we learn more. That kind of gives God some room to lay different things on our heart.
Yeah. I think as Americans, we can sometimes look at the persecuted church and say like, oh man, that's awful. And also we can say, wow, they're the real believers. And we get this guilt complex in ourselves. Like, what am I doing? I'm doing nothing. Can you speak to that?
I'm not responsible to live a Christian life in China because I don't live in China. And I think there's danger on both sides. Like you say, there's the guilt complex of, wow, they're super Christians and I'm like a rookie and I'm trying to, no. We serve the same God. So if you see less of God's power in your life than you do in somebody else's life, it's not because God is less powerful. It's because you're maybe not accessing the full extent of his power. So there's that side, but there's also, like you say, then the sort of guilt side of, well, I don't do anything, I don't this. You're accountable to live for God in the situation that God has placed you in. And if he didn't put you in persecution, then he doesn't expect you to be persecuted. And the flip side of that is if he does put you in persecution, he will give you the grace to endure it.
Yeah.
One of my favorite illustrations of that comes from a lady named Hanali Gronwald. And it was her family, her husband and 2 teenagers were martyred by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And actually, they're the names that we just added to the monument on the day of the Christian martyr. But Hanali Gronwald talked about, and I had her on Voice of the Martyrs radio, she talked about the fact that if you had asked her a year before her family was killed, Hanali, do you have the kind of faith that would survive your whole family being martyred in the same day? She would have said, no, I'm not even close to that kind of faith. No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And she compared it, the grace to go through that, to a boarding pass that you get when you get on a plane. And you don't get your boarding pass a year before you get on the plane. You get your boarding pass when you go to the airport and check in, when it's time for the flight. And she said God's grace for her to go through that came to her literally in the hours and days right before her family was killed. She said, even looking back now, in the days before that, God was building up her faith and God was ministering to her and strengthening her to get her ready, she knows now, to get her ready to go through what I think would be the worst thing that any of us could ever have to go through. So that's very comforting to me because I'm not persecuted. And I sometimes wonder, well, if I was persecuted, would I have the faith? Would I be able to stand up to it? She says, you don't have to be ready to stand up to it now, because when that day comes, God will give you the grace to go through it. God will provide what you need.
Yeah.
And so I think that's very comforting to us as American Christians. If our day comes when we are persecuted, God's grace will be there to carry us through that persecution. And so we don't have to be afraid of it. We don't have to worry about it. And we certainly don't have to feel guilty for not being persecuted now. If our day comes, God's grace will be there for us.
I think that's an excellent point. Like when we look at the New Testament, when Jesus or the Apostle Paul or whoever it is talking about persecution, they're not saying, be afraid of persecution.
Right.
They're saying, be strong, stand firm in the face of persecution.
And, Tertullian is the one who's famously said the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. In the midst of persecution, there are opportunities for the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about prison ministry in China, it's when you get arrested and you go to prison and you do ministry.
Yeah.
It's not like a Saturday night thing where you just go visit. You're an inmate. You're there.
Yeah.
When we are persecuted, the world is watching. Even our persecutors are watching. How do we respond to that? Is our faith real? Is God really that powerful that he can help us to love our persecutors? Well, yes, he is, because Jesus told us we're supposed to do that. And he doesn't ask us to do things that are impossible. But that's an amazing witness. When the world watches and says, wait a minute, that guy beat on you and you still loved him? Well, how could you do that? Well, let me tell you how. That's an incredible opportunity to be a witness for Christ.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Todd. Appreciate your time.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
In the years since my interview with Todd, I've thought about persecution very differently. Whenever I hear about it on the news or in the headlines, I remember what Todd said that persecuted believers want the most. They want prayer, but not prayer for relief. Rather, they want prayer that God would give them the strength to endure. So I try to make it a point to pray for them right then, right there, even as I'm reading the headline. I don't try to put it off or tell myself that I'll pray for them in the evening because more likely than not, I'm just going to forget. I try to take action right away, and I'm not perfect about it by any means, but at least it's a starting point. One other thing that struck me is how God has orchestrated events both throughout history and in our individual lives to bring him glory. And although Todd's friend Shimsa, the widow from Turkey, had a terrible experience in losing her husband, God used that experience to strengthen her faith and the faith of others around her, and even those who had never heard of her but have heard her story now through Todd or through Voice of the Martyrs or even now through this Compelled episode. To learn more about Todd and his work at Voice of the Martyrs, visit persecution.com. And I'd also encourage you to check out his radio show and podcast called Voice of the Martyrs Radio at vomradio.net. You can also visit our website, compelledpodcast.com, and look up this episode for links to both of those websites, as well as some books and other resources that Todd has created. And if you enjoyed this content from this episode, then I really encourage you to listen to episode number 8 of Compelled, which is my interview with Steve Cleary, the very first employee of Voice of the Martyrs. And if you know someone who would be encouraged by Todd's story today, then please send this to them. It's episode number 25 with Todd Nettleton. Now, before we go, we're actually going to leave you with one last story that actually comes from Todd's podcast, Voice of the Martyrs Radio. This is just an excerpt, but you can listen to the entire story on his podcast.
How much did you think about safety and security? And there are safer places to serve the Lord than the Middle East, at least from an earthly perspective.
Yeah.
How did you process that idea of risk?
Yeah, when you're a young 22-year-old, you're pretty young and zealous, and people talk about the risk and the danger, but on one hand, you don't fully comprehend, what that fully means for your life, and on the other hand, you're young and zealous, and you kind of want the adventure, want the danger, want to be in some level of risk. So that was definitely my process when I was younger, and it's one thing hearing about the possibility of persecution. And then it's another thing when it actually, happens, and you kind of have to count the cost all over again once it's happening in your own life.
Once you got there and got kind of situated, you're learning the language. What was ministry like? Because obviously most of the places in the Middle East, it's not like you put up a sign and say, yeah, I'm the local missionary. I just want to talk to people about Jesus. What was a day like for you?
We went to a neighboring Middle Eastern country and met a guy who was really walking in a lot of boldness in ministry and did a lot of street evangelism and praying for Muslims for healing. And it was the first time in my life being with him out at a local mall in the Middle East where I saw it before my eyes, this man, a committed follower of Jesus, offering prayer for healing for Muslims. And I began to see Muslims get healed before my eyes, where a Muslim's jaw would drop because pain left their ear or left their back after this man prayed in Jesus' name. So through that, I really got encouraged and inspired, like, wow, praying for Muslims is a huge open door, just with friends you meet or even people you meet on the street in public. Muslims, they're so religious. They talk about God all the time, in everything. And it feels a bit normal, I think, to them to bring up religious or, God type conversation. So I've found that probably over 90% of the Muslims I've met in the Middle East say yes to the question, can I pray for you? And so many opportunities to offer prayer for healing and seeing Jesus supernaturally heal people, which opens up the door to share the gospel. So we did a lot of street evangelism, actually, which I think was fruitful in many ways.
One of the things you said earlier, and I think we have had that theme come up in other VM radio conversations, is the idea that Muslims are very religious, and talking about religion is not sort of a taboo in their culture. It's like the normal thing to talk about. And how did you find that? And how were you able to use that as a kind of an opening to say, hey, yeah, I want to talk about religion too?
Yeah, like you said, it's not taboo at all. So yeah, just asking a person basic questions about their faith. Obviously, they're, happy to share about their faith and their culture.
And do you feel like they're trying to convert you at that point? Like, hey, I know you're from America, so you're probably not a Muslim, so I'm going to tell you the true way. And
not every Muslim's trying to, be super strong and wanting to convert you. But yeah, I mean, as you know, in Islam, the Bible is considered one of the holy books, one of the holy books God has given us. Obviously, they believe it's been corrupted, but most Muslims can't really answer the question of like, why is it corrupted?
How is it corrupted?
How is it
And
corrupted?
where are the,
Yeah, I feel like it's just not too difficult, and it's not a weird question to just be like, hey, have you ever read the Bible? Would you like to just read the Bible with me regularly? Would you be interested? And even that question, more Muslims than you maybe think may say yes to that question.
Nathan, the day came when you actually got arrested. So one of these conversations didn't go the kind, gentle way. It went to, oh no, we're taking you to jail. Tell me about that day. Tell me about that experience.
Yeah, it was, late August of 2024 where me and two other missionary friends with me were out doing street evangelism, and we're having a fruitful, good time talking to different people, but talked to one guy and he didn't seem very offended in the moment, but it turned out after we left, he called security of the place. And then before we knew it, we were in the security office and they told us that the police were coming to arrest us. Not long after that, about 9 high-level, kind of FBI-level police officers storm into the security office, put us against the wall, and handcuff us behind our backs. So that was the initial arrest moment.
So what's going on in that moment in your heart, in your mind? And
right away, it felt like, wow, this feels like it has a level of seriousness to it that in our previous years, we've had some run-ins here and there with the police, but it kind of turned into just a slap on the wrist or a warning. But the vibe of the whole arrest felt like, wow, this feels very serious in their eyes, and I'm not sure what's going to happen. Yeah, so fear, some anxiety, the uncertainty.
Because by this time, you weren't a single missionary anymore. Like, you had a family at this point.
Yeah. So married in 2018. I have a 2.5-year-old daughter. And then at the point of my arrest, had a just under 3-month-old son.
Oh, my. So how is the Lord speaking to you? How is the Lord calming you? Like, what's going on inside of you?
We end up getting arrested. Kind of fast forward the story a little bit. We get taken to the local jail. Still have some hope. Maybe they'll release us tonight. I'm not sure. But we get interrogated that night. And at the end of the night, they say, you guys are going to prison. And they throw us in prison. And deep fear and deep anxiety definitely consumed my heart and my friends' hearts at different times. I mean, it was some of the most intense feelings that I felt. It felt like just like a fiery bowling ball of like fear and anxiety on your chest, like weighing it down. It was pretty wild. Just the uncertainty of, are they going to physically harm us? Will we be in here 3 days or 3 months or what? What are the charges exactly? Just, your mind kind of gets going as to what will happen to you. So we felt like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire, and Jesus really started to show up for us in amazing ways. But aside from the interrogations, they kept us together the entire time. It was such a gift.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What an incredible gift.
Yeah.
Talk to me about some of those ways that Jesus showed up.
Yeah. So I would say, the days are long in prison and the fear and anxiety was quite consuming. But on day 3, we just had this simple idea that popped in our mind. We were like, hey, we have water that they give us and we have prison bread. Jesus can turn water into wine. Let's start taking communion together with this water and prison bread. And it felt like really quite supernatural. We were so full of the weight of fear and anxiety. And I remember the first time we took communion, the 3 of us, it was almost as if Jesus just walked into the cell and took anxiety off our left shoulder, fear off our right shoulder, gave us peace instead, and then walked out. Like, it was very supernatural.
Wow.
How just night and day different we felt after taking communion. And then it was interesting, about 3 hours later, the fear and anxiety would come back. So very simple. We didn't know what to do other than, hey, communion worked 3 hours ago. Let's take communion again. So that resulted in our entire time in prison. We took communion 3 times a day. And Jesus really was faithful to lift our burdens each and every time.
If you'd like to hear the rest of that story, then just search for the Voice of the Martyrs radio podcast and look up the episode titled arrested in the Middle East, prison was a mission field. You know, it's our joy to release these stories for free, but that's only because of our sponsors and the generous financial support of our listeners like you. If you want to help us continue creating more stories just like Todd's, then consider joining Compelled as a monthly partner. You'll get access to all of our behind-the-scenes interviews with over 100 hours of additional interview content that we never had time to publish. And you'll also get access to all of our new episodes 1 week early without ads. There's no set price, it's totally up to you. Just choose the monthly amount that makes sense for you, and by doing that, you're helping us create new episodes of Compelled. To join as a monthly partner or to make a one-time donation, just visit compelledpodcast.com/donate. Today's story was edited by Zach Fowler and Micah Foster, script assistance from Mark Weber, sound engineering by Sonomorphic, and our associate producer is my amazing wife, Sarah Hastings. I'm your host, Paul Hastings, and you've been listening to Compelled. We'll be back next time with another compelling story. We'll see you then.